Let's talk about some operating rules and limitations for flying drones. One cardinal rule that applies all the time is that at least one flight crew member, either the remote PIC, the person manipulating the controls, or the visual observer, must be able to see the aircraft at all times during flight. This requirement is called visual line of sight, or VLOS, and it must be maintained with unaided vision, except for the use of eyeglasses or corrective lenses. Visual aids such as binoculars may only be used briefly to enhance situational awareness, such as to avoid flying over people or avoiding other aircraft. Now, the FAA does not set specific vision standards for crew members, but they do recommend that flight crew members maintain normal field of vision and 20/20 corrected distant visual acuity. Maintaining visual line of sight is required so that the crew can know the aircraft's location, attitude, altitude, and direction of flight, and so they can watch the airspace for traffic and hazards and ensure the aircraft does not endanger the life or property of another person. Now, because of this requirement, the SUAS must be operated closely enough to ensure that visual line of sight can be maintained. Crew members are allowed to have brief moments when they are not looking at or cannot see the aircraft to aid in the safety of the operation. An example would be looking at the controller display to check on battery life remaining. Or you can have brief moments when you are not maintaining VLOS for operational necessity. But in these situations, crew members must be able to either still see the SUAS or quickly regain visual line of sight. Maybe during search operations at a fire scene, you have to fly the aircraft behind some smoke. And during these moments, the remote PIC still has see and avoid responsibilities with other aircraft and obstacles. Now, because the reason for these moments vary, there is no specific time limit for operating with loss of visual line of sight. But when visual line of sight is lost unintentionally, it must be regained immediately. And when it is lost intentionally, it must be regained as soon as practicable. And if it cannot be either regained or maintained, the crew should follow pre-planned procedures for loss of visual line of sight, which may include immediate landing, going into hover mode, or executing a return to home sequence. Now let's you and I talk about the remote ID rule listed in Part 89. I like things easy to understand, so let me get to the nitty-gritty. What the remote ID rule says is, if you're flying an unmanned aircraft that is registered or required to be registered, then your unmanned aircraft will have to continuously transmit, from takeoff to shutdown, information about its identification and location so that people on the ground can find your drone and, if they need to, find you. See, the FAA wants you to know that this information is needed to ensure public safety and the safety and security of the airspace, because remote ID is the foundation for all kinds of government agencies to identify compliant operations from those that are not. Now, the remote ID rule is not just for commercial operations. Even recreational unmanned aircraft are required to comply with the remote ID rule. So you might be asking yourself, just how does remote ID work? First, as of September 16, 2023, each unmanned aircraft is required to have a miniature radio transmitter on board that will continuously broadcast the required remote ID information. That information includes its identifying serial or session number, which is like an identifier for a particular flight, its takeoff location, current location and altitude, velocity, a time mark identifying each output message, and more. Now, there are 3 ways we remote pilots can ensure compliance with the rule. One is that the manufacturer of the unmanned aircraft combines what the FAA calls a standard remote ID with the aircraft when it's on the production line. 2, if you build the unmanned aircraft yourself, or if you're retrofitting an older drone, you'll need to install a commercially available broadcast module. And 3 is that you fly in an FAA-approved area called an FAA-recognized identification area, or FRIA for those who like acronyms. Flights in FRIAs will not require the installation of either a standard remote ID unit or a broadcast module. You can think of FRIAs as free flight zones. Well, almost, because these areas must still be approved by the FAA before you operate in them. So now you know that someone may just be watching, although they'll be doing it remotely. Now, as a remote pilot, you need to know that the FAA has established 4 drone categories, and these are simply named Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, and you guessed it, Category 4. The FAA established these categories as a way to rank the potential injury, harm, or damage a drone could cause if it were to crash into someone or something. And that's not a pleasant thought. These category rankings are important for when you start thinking about flights over people and vehicles. Category 1 drones are the lightweight ones weighing less than 0.55 pounds with everything attached. And unlike this drone, it cannot have any exposed parts that would, as the FAA says, lacerate human skin. And it does not require an FAA-accepted means of compliance or a declaration of compliance. Basically, this means you, as the remote pilot in command, make the determination that the drone you're flying meets Category 1 definitions. Now, Category 2 is where things start getting a bit more complicated. A Category 2 drone cannot be able to cause injury to a person equal to or greater than the severity of injury that would be caused by the transfer of 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. I'm not sure how one measures 11 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, but what is for sure, the faster the drone is going, either in forward speed or falling from the sky, if it hits someone or something, the more severe the injury or the damage is going to be. Just like Category 1, it cannot have any exposed parts that would lacerate human skin. It also cannot have any safety deficiencies. But then again, neither you nor I would fly anything with a safety deficiency. Category 2 requires that the drone does have an FAA-accepted means of compliance or a declaration of compliance. This will most likely come from the manufacturer of your drone. Okay, Category 3 is somewhat like Category 2, but with Category 3, your drone cannot be able to cause injury to a person equal to or greater than the severity of injury caused by the transfer of 25 pounds of kinetic energy. Now, the reason for these constraints is because the FAA is approving flights over people and vehicles under certain conditions, depending on the drone category. And finally, Category 4 is drones that have airworthiness certificates issued under Part 21. By the way, Part 21 certification covers, among other things, light sport aircraft. So a Category 4 drone is like a certificated aircraft. Keep in mind that Part 21 aircraft are not prohibited from flying over people or vehicles. Now let's see how the categories of 1 through 4 apply when using your drone for flights over people. But first, let's talk a little bit about the risk and consequences of doing so. Any flying object that has both altitude and speed and is over people has the potential for causing injury, maybe severe injury, or even worse. And as a part of your risk assessment, you'll want to consider the consequences should your drone fail in a way that causes someone injury or worse. Remember, as the remote PIC, you are ultimately responsible for the safety of yourself, your crew, and the public. So fly wisely. Always leave yourself an out and your drone an out, and consider those that could be adversely impacted by your decisions. Now, if the drone you happen to be flying is either Category 1 or Category 2, the FAA says that if you're going to maintain sustained flight over an open-air assembly of people, your drone must be equipped with remote ID. So, what is an open-air assembly of people? Well, this could include, among other things, areas like parks, athletic fields, grandstands, outdoor theaters, stadiums, lots of stuff like that. Basically, if people have gathered, you might consider that, or at least the FAA might consider that, an open-air assembly of people. Now, if your drone is a Category 3, you cannot operate over an open-air assembly of people. Never. However, with a Category 3 drone, you may operate over a person or persons if they are in a closed or restricted access site. An example might be, for instance, a fenced construction site where you've been hired to conduct a mapping mission. And this only applies if those on site are notified that a drone may fly over them. Now, the FAA does not mean you can hover over someone's head if you have notified them. That would certainly be considered sustained flight. For sustained flight over someone while using a Category 3 drone, the FAA says that's okay if that person or persons are directly participating in the drone operation, like a visual observer, or if they are under a protective cover, which, by the way, is not a baseball cap, but some sort of sturdy cover that if the drone were to fall from the sky, it would crash into the cover, not into that person's head. For Category 4 drones, you'll recall that they have to be certified under Part 21. Your responsibility then would be to comply with the limitations specified in the flight manual. Now let's cover flying your drone over moving vehicles with folks inside. But before we get too far, let me say that as a responsible drone operator, you'll want to consider those same risk management fundamentals we mentioned earlier. Now, if the drone you happen to be flying meets either Category 1, 2, or 3, you may operate your drone over a vehicle with people inside if the flight is transitory, meaning you are not allowed to maintain sustained flight over the vehicle. Now, if that vehicle with someone inside is in a closed or restricted access site, this time, let's say a movie set, and those on site are notified that a drone may fly over them, you can fly the drone in sustained flight over the vehicle. Now, if you happen to be flying a drone that meets Category 4, that drone must have an airworthiness certificate and be operated in compliance with the published operating limitations. Now, the regulations say nothing about a vehicle without folks inside. So if you happen to see a vehicle driving by itself with no one inside, I guess that's open season. Let's take a look at some other operating limitations. You cannot fly an SUAS faster than a ground speed of 87 knots, which translates to 100 miles per hour. You also cannot fly higher than 400 feet above ground level or 400 feet above a structure's uppermost limit when the SUAS is within a 400-foot radius of the structure. For example, if you have a 900-foot tower like this one, you are allowed to go 400 feet above the tower as long as you stay within 400 feet horizontally of that tower. You need to know that while most manned aircraft operations will be above 500 feet AGL, there are some exceptions you should look out for. Helicopters can, and frequently do, operate below 500 feet AGL as they fly, not just when they're taking off and landing. And hang gliders spend a lot of time below 500 feet AGL. We'll talk about how to identify areas where hang gliders operate in a later lesson. When operating an SUAS, you must have at least 3 statute miles visibility, and you must operate the SUAS at least 500 feet below the clouds and 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds. As the remote PIC, you also have see and avoid responsibility, which means you are responsible to keep clear of and yield to other aircraft. And you cannot use the camera on board the drone to do this. That's called a first-person view camera. This does not prohibit you from using a first-person view camera during your operations. You just have to meet the see and avoid requirement without relying on the camera for it. Now, here's a regulation you can figure out with just common sense. You cannot operate an SUAS in a careless or reckless manner so as to endanger another person's life or property, such as interfering with other aircraft, loading the aircraft beyond its capability to the point of losing control, or dropping objects from an SUAS in a manner that creates undue hazard to persons or property. Also, no one may act as a remote PIC or visual observer in operations involving more than one SUAS at the same time. Now, under Part 107, you are allowed to transport property for compensation or hire. Here comes the repo drone. But when you are transporting property for compensation or hire, you must make sure the total weight of the aircraft remains under 55 pounds. This includes the property being transported, sometimes called the payload. So this repo drone is about 3,000 pounds overweight. Now, these operations must be done within a confined area, which is defined horizontally by the visual line of sight requirement and vertically by the requirement to keep the SUAS at or below 400 feet AGL. The operation must also be flown within the bounds of a state. That's called intrastate. It cannot involve interstate air transportation, which is transport from one state to another. That's a no-no. Part 107 also allows you to operate an SUAS from a moving land or waterborne vehicle as long as the operation is over a sparsely populated or unpopulated area. However, you cannot operate an SUAS from a moving aircraft, and you cannot operate from a moving vehicle when carrying another person's property for compensation or hire. And when operating from a moving vehicle, you must still follow all Part 107 regulations, such as maintaining visual line of sight, maintaining effective communications, not operating directly over people that are not involved in your operation, and avoiding operating in a careless or reckless manner. Now, flying an SUAS while driving a moving vehicle would be careless or reckless. So the driver of the vehicle cannot be the remote PIC, the person manipulating the controls, or the visual observer. One other thing, be sure to comply with any local or state laws about driving while distracted. Part 107 prohibits carrying hazardous material. So this repo drone carrying radioactive material is highly illegal. Hazardous material is defined as a substance or material that the Secretary of Transportation has determined that when transported can pose an unreasonable risk to health, safety, or property. So, what about lithium batteries? Lithium batteries that are installed in the SUAS for power are not considered a hazardous material under Part 107. But spares or uninstalled batteries are considered hazardous material and cannot be carried on the SUAS. Privacy is a big concern for the general population when it comes to drones, so it is something you should consider. Now, state and local laws may apply to your operations, and as a remote PIC, you are responsible for reviewing these laws and complying with them. Go to knowbeforeyoufly.org, where you can find information and links to voluntary best practices for private and commercial UAS operators, such as news gatherers and private use in neighborhoods. Under Fly Responsibly, select UAS Best Practices. It will take you to this page. Then, down here, you'll see this somewhat hidden link. Click on it to review the guidelines. Now, if you follow these guidelines, it will help keep you out of trouble regarding privacy, transparency, and accountability. Now, one other thing you need to know is that you must inform the FAA if you change your name or address. If you change your name, you must provide the FAA with your remote pilot certificate and a copy of the document verifying the name change, such as a marriage license or court order. These documents will be returned to you after inspection. If you change your permanent mailing address, you must notify the FAA within 30 days in order to continue exercising the privileges of your certificate. You can notify them by going to the FAA's UAS website and searching on Update Your Address. Or you can choose to send a letter by snail mail to this address. And that, folks, is what you need to know about the operating rules and limitations when flying your drone.